There's a particular kind of unease that creeps in quietly. The feeling that something between you and the person you love has shifted, even when you can't find the words to describe what changed or when it started. If that feeling is familiar to you, stay with this because what follows might finally put language to something you've been carrying alone. Here's what most people misunderstand about how emotional behavior actually works. The common image of betrayal is something sudden, a door slamming, a confession, a moment that splits time into before and after. But that's not how human behavior truly operates. In psychology, every meaningful change in how someone feels leaves a trail. Quiet signals, small shifts, patterns of behavior that begin surfacing long before anything is acknowledged or spoken out loud. And this is where it becomes painful in a very specific way. When a man is deeply in love, his own mind becomes his adversary. It explains things away. It tells him she's exhausted, that work has been brutal, that she's dealing with something privately. The mind protects what it's attached to, but here's what the mind cannot change. Attraction, emotional investment, and secrecy always alter the way a person behaves, without exception. Through the study of relationships and the patterns that emerge across countless cases involving couples and individuals, one thing surfaces with remarkable consistency. When a woman begins directing her emotional energy toward something new, she almost never announces it. What unfolds instead is a quiet, gradual transformation in her behavior, one that leaves her partner feeling disoriented rather than informed. This isn't always rooted in a desire to cause harm. Human beings have a remarkable capacity for separating their inner worlds from each other. A person can hold genuine care for someone while simultaneously redirecting their emotional current elsewhere. And that tension, the pull between guilt and excitement and loyalty, inevitably begins showing up in how she moves, how she speaks, how she inhabits the same space as the man beside her. What makes all of this so difficult to catch early is that the signs are too soft to grip. Something feels off, but it's not concrete enough to confront. So what follows is a closer look at the psychological patterns that tend to emerge when a woman's emotional loyalty begins drifting away from the relationship she's in. Not accusations, not assumptions, just patterns. Because when you understand what behavior is actually communicating, you stop doubting your own perception and start seeing things with genuine clarity. The first signal almost never looks like what men expect. In fact, it's the very thing that makes them question whether their instincts can be trusted. It arrives subtly. Her energy around you begins to feel different. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a room gradually becomes cooler when someone has slowly been lowering the temperature. She seems a little less alive when she sees you. Conversations that used to flow between you naturally now feel like they're running out of road. She's present, she's listening, but whatever used to light up behind her eyes seems to have been dimmed by a few degrees. This is the moment where most men make a costly mistake. They read the distance as something they caused, and so they respond by intensifying. More messages, more plans, more effort, more reaching towards someone who seems to be replenishing from somewhere else entirely. And psychologically, that's precisely what is happening. Emotional energy functions like a battery. When someone becomes drawn toward a new connection, intrigued, pulled, fascinated, that battery starts charging in a different direction, and the place it once recharged begins running dry. The first thing a man will notice is this withdrawal. She may still be physically there, she may still move through the rhythms of the relationship, but the texture of it has changed. There's less warmth in how she looks at him, less spontaneous softness, less of that effortless intimacy that used to exist without either of them manufacturing it. Not because something in him failed, but because attention, the real currency of connection, has quietly begun flowing somewhere else. Then something else arrives that catches men completely off guard. The emotional withdrawal begins producing friction. Suddenly, small things that never used to register seem to irritate her. The humor that always landed between you doesn't anymore. Your presence sometimes feels like it's in the way, and somewhere inside you, a painful question begins to take shape. Why does it feel like she's pulling back? The psychological explanation matters here. When a person is caught between two emotional realities, the mind often generates distance as a mechanism for managing guilt. That distance doesn't introduce itself as guilt. It surfaces as coolness, as shortened patience, as a kind of quiet emotional unavailability. Men who encounter this typically respond by chasing reassurance. They want to hear that everything is fine. But reassurance doesn't repair emotional drift. Understanding what's generating the behavior does. And almost always, once that distance settles in, a second pattern follows just behind it. Her world becomes more guarded than it ever used to be. Privacy is legitimate in any relationship. Everyone deserves personal space and conversations that belong only to them. But there is a clear psychological difference between healthy privacy and a sudden, uncharacteristic need for secrecy. And when emotional loyalty begins migrating towards someone new, secrecy tends to rise in direct proportion. The changes are small at first. Her phone faces downward more often than it used to. Notifications that once appeared openly now disappear before they can be registered. She moves into another room to respond to messages she would have answered right beside you before. None of these individually amounts to anything, but patterns reveal what isolated moments cannot, because behavior doesn't shift without a cause. When a person begins investing emotionally in someone outside the relationship, the mind instinctively becomes protective of that new connection. Often it isn't even deliberate. It's almost automatic, like the mind constructing an invisible barrier around something it finds stimulating and wants to preserve. She may not become defensive about her phone, just quietly shielded. If you enter the room unexpectedly, the screen goes dark a little faster. If you ask who she's been speaking with, the answer feels slightly off, vague, too brief, or deliberately casual. Most men talk themselves out of trusting what they're picking up in these moments. They don't want to appear insecure. They don't want to seem controlling, so they push the discomfort down and move forward. But instinct isn't the same thing as paranoia. The brain is constantly processing microsignals, small shifts in tone, fluctuations in body language, changes in emotional energy. When those signals stop matching the relationship a person believed they were in, something inside them begins searching for an explanation. And here is the critical distinction worth understanding. Secrecy isn't always about concealing a specific act. Sometimes it's about protecting an emotional connection that hasn't fully taken shape yet. Psychologists call this emotional compartmentalization, the mental separation of two coexisting realities so they don't collide with each other. On one side, the established relationship. On the other, a new source of attention that feels electric and validating and alive. To keep those two worlds from crashing into each other, invisible walls go up. Routines shift without explanation. Conversations that once opened freely begin to close off. And if that internal division goes on long enough, something else begins to appear. Something that confuses men more than almost anything else in this entire process. Rather than simply becoming more distant, she may begin growing unusually critical of him. When emotional loyalty starts moving towards someone new, a strange psychological mechanism often activates. Instead of feeling more warmly toward an existing partner, a person may begin fixating on that partner's imperfections. Things that were once overlooked start feeling worth addressing. Habits that never registered as problems suddenly seem significant. From his perspective, it can feel like the relationship has been placed under a magnifying glass and everything he does is coming up short. He might begin hearing things like, "You've changed," or "You don't really understand me," or "You used to try harder." And his natural response is to take it at face value. He looks inward. He tries to communicate with more care. He attempts to become whatever she seems to be gesturing toward. But there is a psychological dynamic at work here that rarely gets named directly. When a person begins developing emotional investment in someone else, the mind often launches a quiet, unconscious process of justification. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two incompatible truths at the same time. On one side, loyalty to a partner. On the other, a growing pull towards something new. To relieve that internal tension, the brain begins quietly rewriting the story of the current relationship. The qualities that once drew her in receive less attention. The imperfections grow louder, his flaws feel more pronounced, his limitations feel heavier, and gradually the internal narrative shifts from "this relationship is meaningful to me" towards "something here is broken." This doesn't mean every criticism inside a relationship carries this weight. But when criticism becomes relentless, emotionally sharp, and unconnected to any genuine desire to work through things together, something deeper is usually driving it. Because making the relationship feel flawed gives the mind permission to drift further with less guilt attached. And many men at this stage respond by chasing approval even harder. They adjust, they perform, they bend, they try to earn back something that isn't being withheld for the reasons they believe. The final signal is the quietest of all. It doesn't arrive with force, it simply settles in. and it shows up in where her time, her focus, and her actual presence go. How a person allocates their time and energy is one of the most honest reflections of what they genuinely value. People gravitate naturally toward what excites them, what engages them, what makes them feel emotionally alive. So when a woman becomes genuinely absorbed somewhere else, her daily patterns begin to reflect that in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. She's harder to reach than she used to be. Arranging time together takes more negotiation than it ever did. Cancellations begin happening with greater frequency. Rescheduling becomes the norm rather than the exception. And even when you're together, her presence isn't fully there. That's what cuts deepest. Not an empty schedule, but an empty presence. You can sit directly across from someone and feel completely alone with them. Attention drifts mid-conversation. Responses grow shorter. What once required no effort between you now feels like something that has to be deliberately assembled. And that's when a specific kind of anxiety begins building quietly underneath everything. You start questioning whether you're imagining it, whether you're being too sensitive, whether the relationship is dissolving right in front of you and you're simply the last to accept it. The truth that rarely gets spoken plainly is this: when someone's emotional focus relocates to another place, the relationship they're already in begins to feel less like something they're choosing and more like something they're simply obligated to maintain. If any part of this gave voice to something you've been sitting with, pass it on to someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most grounding thing is simply knowing that what you're sensing is real.